You're watching Fermentation 101 by Dr. Lissagal on Resonance Wellness TV, part of our Whole Life Medicine Alleviates series. Keep in the loop about future webinars and events on whole-life-medicine.com. Hello and welcome to this webinar on fermentation. My name is Dr. Lissagal and I'll be your guide this evening about all things fermented. And as usual, this presentation is given in the context of the whole life medicine model. And so when we talk about fermentation, we're talking about potential missing ingredients in the diet. So as many of you know, I love to talk about diet, both in modern and historical contexts, with your health in mind. And you might also remember from previous lectures that I've described the ideal diet as having a small percentage of ferments in it. And so in this lecture, we're going to have some fun looking at the way ferments are part of how humans have fed themselves for many millennia and how you can think about their use in your own diet. Let's just talk about what fermentation is to begin with. So technically, fermentation is the chemical conversion of sugars in foods to an alcohol or to an acid by the metabolic actions of yeast or bacteria. So the word fermentation has its roots in the Latin fervere. So that means to boil, bubble, or seethe. Hopefully not too much seething. And offshoots of this kind of like language branch are pretty alive and well in today's English. So our word fervent kind of evokes some of the effervescent frenzy that occurs when we ferment food. And so there's three types of fermentation. There's lactic acid fermentation, there's ethyl alcohol fermentation, and acetic acid fermentation. And we're going to describe these in a few minutes. But first, let's talk for a minute about how fermentation works. So in your body, microorganisms survive mainly by using the carbohydrates you eat as a fuel for creating energy. So a carbohydrate technically is what we classify as a sugar. There's a great deal of complexity in carbohydrates, sometimes all the way to very, very simple sugars. And often the things that we think of as sugar, like sucrose, is a very, very simple sugar. But pretty much every carbohydrate is technically a sugar. So you have an entire microbiome of organisms colonizing your guts and your skin, your genitals. And of course, they're a great assistance to you when those organisms can do biochemical processes that you can't do. So we've talked about the microbiome several times this year, as you may recall, and fermentation is one of the major biochemical processes that's found in nature. So you yourself can use fermentation as a process to produce energy if you need to, but that condition is known as having an anaerobic metabolism. So any of you who have tested out anaerobic on your metabolic type will know that I have told you that this particular kind of metabolism is not very efficient, especially for a complex creature like a human. It's not very efficient to supply our massive energy needs with fermentation. And full-on lactic acid fermentation in the muscle, you will produce 18 times less energy than you're capable of producing. So normally every molecule of glucose that you burn, you actually get 36 energy molecules or 36 ATPs out of it. And in a fully fermenting metabolism in the muscle, if you've exhausted your fuels, you will only produce 2 energy molecules. So it's a big, big change. It's 18 times less efficient. So, but the exact same process in bacteria and yeast is used in food preservation and in production to break down the sugars that are found in pretty much most natural products. So vegetables, fruits, grains, and dairy. And like I said before, those sugars are then converted into types of acid and alcohols. So the acid and alcohol produced will preserve the food. So it allows it to be stored for much longer without spoiling. And then the breakdown processes that your microorganisms do can make food compounds more bioavailable. so that you'll get more from the food that you eat. So essentially, when a food is fermented, it's broken down in specific ways, similarly to the way that it would be broken down in your gut. So fermentation is really not a new thing. It's really since the Neolithic age, so that's like 10,000 years ago to about 10,000 BC. So I guess 12,000 years ago to about 2000 BCE, people have been fermenting foods. So that's way before, anybody figured out what was like happening on a microbiological level. So some of it was probably originally accidental. Things like berries fermenting on the bush, or a meat or milk product fermenting. And when you don't have any other way to preserve it, it's very handy. So there is evidence that Neolithic humans fermented grains like sorghum, very much on purpose to make leavened bread. There are pottery shards that are dating from that era that also show evidence of wine. So one of the oldest traceable fermented substances is mead. That's fermented honey. Its earliest known description appears in the Rig Veda. So that's a collection of the Vedic Sanskrit hymns that was written about 3,700 years ago. And lots of other cultures also share a historic love of making fermented drinks. The Sumerians had a goddess, Ninkasi, who was devoted to beer and the fermenting process behind it. And it's assumed that what the ancient Greeks called ambrosia, or nectar of the gods, was actually, in fact, mead. So it's been proposed that the word honeymoon refers to the fermented honey drink and its impassioned after effects. And I really recommend, if you have never tasted mead before, to check out Chinook Honey. So this is a shop on a honey farm right outside Okotoks, and they collect honey locally, and they ferment it with berries and herbs right on site. We also have Spirit Hills Flower Winery out in Millerville. They have a pretty smashing dandelion mead. And so you can go and experiment with with eating the fermented products of honey. And ferments, like I said, have been made in pretty much every culture. Australian Aboriginal, the Inuit fermented fish as a preservation method. So there's an amazing number of ferments. And I have actually observed that most people have no idea how many ferments there actually are, especially in Canada, where everyone is from somewhere else. We have so many foods that are fermented, and sometimes you might not even realize that you're eating a ferment. In fact, there's so many. I really enjoyed this slide. I'm hoping you can puff this up a little bit bigger on your screen to see all of these. But this is a great graphic, and it basically illustrates just some of what's available in the world for ferments. So this diagram actually leaves out cheese as a whole category because there's just no way of fitting all the cheese types on this chart. But what we can see here are ferments using plants. So we can see fruit in that upper left. We can see veggies, seeds, legumes and grains, and animal products like seafood, animal meat, and dairy. And maybe you recognize some of these products, things like natto or tempeh, obviously wine, kombucha, Worcestershire sauce, the famous British sauce that people put cheese on toast, fish sauce, and from Southeast Asia, sour cream, very prevalent in my Ukrainian grandmother's cooking, salami. And who hasn't been to Hawaii and at least tried to eat poi? Poi is actually a ferment. So across Asia, fermenting has really long been used to preserve perishables like fish, while it really retains or enhances health benefits. So one of the oldest forms of fermented fish is kapi. So that's shrimp paste that originated in the Southeast and is as early as the 8th century. Inhabitants of modern-day Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore would harvest freshly hatched shrimp, dry them on bamboo mats in the sun, and then ferment them. And it preserved the shrimp for months, sometimes years. And so you've probably used or eaten shrimp paste. So we know that the enzymes in shrimp paste help promote heart health. They lower cholesterol. They break up dangerous blood clots in the veins. But of course, in our germophobic culture, we often pasteurize the living daylights out of things. And sometimes that's problematic for getting the most well-made ferments. And we're going to come back to this later. But I thought this was a great diagram. This is actually from Popular Science. And they just did a beautiful job here of showing ferments and combination ferments where you're actually using more than one substance to create a ferment. An example here, like I said, was Worcestershire, where you clearly have a fruit component, and you have a grain component, and you have a seafood component. And who doesn't have Worcestershire in their cupboard? I think pretty much everybody does. So let's first talk about the three major types of fermentation, like I promised. So let's talk about lactic acid fermentation. And in this type of fermentation, a group of bacteria are converting carbohydrates, again, starch or sugar, into primarily lactic acid. And this is the same lactic acid that you are producing in your muscles. Now, lactic acid bacteria are really the most important bacteria in food fermentation. They help us to produce sourdough bread, all the fermented milks, and most, quote unquote, pickled vegetables. So the main species are lactobacillus, which I am sure you've all heard of. And alongside that, there are a couple of other species. One's called Leuconostoc, one's called Pediococcus, and one's called Streptococcus. And yes, you heard that last one correctly. We assume that Streptococcus is something that is only pathological. It actually is not always pathological. There are many other bacteria that are identified in lactic acid fermentation, but they usually don't play as big of a role in human food production as these four major species. So lactic acid bacteria don't require oxygen to convert sugars. Because of this, they don't make drastic changes in the composition of a food because they mostly just end up putting lactic acid into the food. So without oxygen present, fermented foods are also more likely to maintain their original color. Otherwise, they would brown. So Lactobacillus acidophilus, Lactobacillus bulgaris, Lactobacillus plantarum. These are major examples of lactic acid producing bacteria involved in food fermentations. And all of the species of lactic acid bacteria have their own particular reactions and niches, but overall, the Lactobacillus plantarum produces high acidity in vegetable fermentations and really does play the major role out of those group. So you might have heard of that bacteria advertised in certain brands of yogurt. So the mix of organisms can actually create variations in the taste of the final product because each species does things a little tiny bit differently. And so when people produce ferments, a lot of what they are doing, especially if they're branded, with a certain taste, is they're finding ways of using those organisms to produce certain tastes that are kind of characteristic of their product. And so they'll have their own mix, usually, of different organisms. So Leuconostoc, mesonthoides, actually, is the species name. It's a bacterium that's associated with the sauerkraut and the pickle fermentations, too. And this organism initiates the beginning of the lactic acid fermentation in these products. And it actually differs from other lactic acid species. It can tolerate fairly high concentrations of salt and sugar. So often it's the one that's going to be predominant when people are putting more sugar in their vegetables. Like some people prefer the taste of a pickle being sweet. And so it depends a little bit on the mixture of the brine, which organism is going to multiply the most. So when the bacteria eat the sugars in the food, they produce carbon dioxide and acids. So the acids rapidly lower the pH, and that inhibits the development of undesirable microorganisms and molds. And so it actually makes lactofermentation very safe, and it usually very consistently turns out a good result. So the reactions performed by the bacteria are super adaptable to the conditions that they find themselves in. And that's part of the reason why they're so successful for use in products made for our consumption and also the ones that we can make at home. Now, the next kind of fermentation is ethyl alcohol fermentation. And in this type of fermentation, it's yeasts that are breaking down the carbohydrate and turning it into alcohol and carbon dioxide molecules too. So in the production of alcohol, sugar is really key, as well as an anaerobic environment. With the pickles, you don't need to put sugar in. Like I said, you can push the organisms towards a different subspecies that are known as lactic acid fermenters. But when you have ethyl alcohol fermentation, sugar is really key. So this type of fermentation creates wine and cider and beer. So fermentation doesn't produce an alcohol content greater than about 12 to 15% because the yeast is actually killed by higher alcohol percentages. So the process initiates, builds up the alcohol, and then basically stops because the yeast is killed off. And so the alcohol becomes a preservative as well as part of the product. So it's super easy to find a home brewing kit and supplies to make your own beer and wine. And the product's usually decent. But of course, many of those products don't end up being on the top end for complexity. That's part of a skill set that vineyards and breweries are really pouring their intention and experience into. So it's easy to see that from sampling beers and ciders and wines, there are very different nuances created in part by the raw materials, but also by variations in the microorganisms that are helping to make the product. So I recommend our friends at Cider House in Calgary. They make their own ciders from Calgary fruit obtained from people with trees full of fruit they can't use. So they make the brand Sunny Cider, and it's a beautiful example of making use of what would otherwise go to waste. And so you can add that field trip to your mead excursion. Cider House is actually a little restaurant where they serve their own cider. It's close to Marlborough in the Northeast, I think. That's the closest neighborhood. Now, the third kind of fermentation is acetic acid fermentation. So in this kind of fermentation, you're taking the carbohydrates from grains and fruit, and you're fermenting it into that sour tasting vinegar. So acetic acid is actually vinegar. So the term vinegar literally means sour wine. And of course, you can observe an unsealed bottle of wine going sour without too much intervention. And in fact, what happens is the alcohol starts to evaporate out, and also with age or with poor processing, with the air, it'll convert actually into the acetic acid. That's why we cork our bottles so tightly to keep the alcohol inside of the bottle. So acetic acid fermentation is what is creating apple cider vinegar or wine vinegar. It's also the process that makes kombucha and kefir. So unlike lactic acid and ethyl alcohol fermentation processes, your acetic acid fermentation requires oxygen to allow the alcohol to degrade to acetic acid. So a different set of organisms and different process are required. So yeasts actually start this process. They produce the alcohol, and then bacteria finish it, converting that alcohol to sugar. So the organisms involved in vinegar production usually grow at the top of the liquid you're fermenting. So it forms like a jelly-like mass. That is known as mother of vinegar. So the mother is composed of a bacteria called acetobacter and yeast, and they're basically working together. So the principal bacteria are like Acetobacter acetic, obviously in reference to just the production of acetic acid. There's a couple of other species. And then the main yeasts are Saccharomyces, both the Cerevisiae, which is basically brewer's yeast, and Ellipsioideus. So this is basically how you make vinegar, and it's not produced that way commercially. Unless you get a small batch wine vinegar, much of the vinegar that we would consume or buy is just made chemically. So it isn't the product of fermentation. Obviously, it's a very consistent product when you get just acetic acid in a vinegar solution. But it kind of has that very non-complex taste to it. It's very different, say, than balsamic vinegar, which is obviously made with the whole process of fermentation, and it has like all these beautiful flavors in it. So kombucha production also uses a mother. So the mother in kombucha is known as a SCOBY. So a SCOBY actually stands for symbiotic cultures of bacteria and yeast. So SCOBY, symbiotic cultures of bacteria and yeast. So this is usually similar to, but it's not exactly the same as the vinegar mother, because the organisms are going to be a little bit different. So it is a great illustration, though, of a cellulose-based matte biofilm. And it gives you a sense, too, of what your own biofilms can be composed of. So we've talked about biofilms in the microbiome and what that kind of looks like. And so a SCOBY is a great example of that, as is a vinegar mother, if you've ever seen that. But I haven't seen too many people super excited about making vinegar for whatever reason, so we're not as into it. So kombucha is basically a carbonated beverage that's made with black or green tea and sugar. And then you add a SCOBY into it. We'll talk about how we make that in a few minutes. Kefir is started with kefir grains to initiate the fermentation. And those are a combination of the bacteria lactobacillus and the yeast Saccharomyces again. So it's producing this kind of three-dimensional microcolony. So those little grains that you get are called kefiran. It's made of equal proportions of glucose and galactose, and it kind of looks like little cauliflower grains. And the color is kind of anywhere from white to a kind of a creamy yellow. And it produces a carbonated beverage in a water sugar solution. So lots of people make kefir in water sugar, but historically it's been made in dairy. And so at the present, the average Russian person probably consumes about 20 liters of kefir a year. So the drink was actually historically used in Soviet hospitals to treat serious illnesses. And there was one very well-known Nobel Prize-winning Russian immunologist who noted that people from the Caucasus region had an exceptionally high life expectancy, and he attributed it to dairy-based kefir. Kefir is actually a Turkish word that translates to, quote, to feel good. So there you go. You're going to try some kefir, hopefully classically made, and you yourself will feel good, unless you are not a very big fan of dairy. So a probiotic, I wanted to just make this distinction, probiotic between probiotics and fermented foods. And so probiotics are live organisms, technically, that have health benefits as a supplement. Most probiotics consist of just a handful of organisms, and most of those organisms are found in fermentation processes. However, it's important to note that these are not the same organisms that make up the majority of the normal flora of a human. So the microbiome of the human includes probably over 25,000 species of bacteria, yeasts, viruses, fungi, protozoans, and it also varies in composition depending on where you look in the gastrointestinal tract. The main organisms that make up the human microbiome are Bacteroides and Firmicutes bacteria. So because they're living organisms, what we eat feeds the microbiome. So in turn, our microbiota metabolizes foods in ways that we can't do. And it helps make certain nutrients more bioavailable to you. So your microbiome is very much regulated in composition by what you eat. When you eat the diet that we've talked about reliably, you'll find that you're going to support your bacteria optimally. So we can, of course, use the probiotic supplements that are available to us to rescue a breakdown in flora, but they are not the whole picture, and you shouldn't have to take them to make things work in the digestion long term. Fermented foods, of course, only contain also a limited mix of organisms, and they're not identical to your flora, nor are they identical to probiotic supplements. So when you're buying a fermented product, there's no regulations that require a specific composition. They don't have to meet any standards. They can contain useful and non-useful organisms. But what you can get in a live ferment are bioavailable nutrients from whatever you're fermenting, along with those live organisms secreting into your inner environment and encouraging the growth of related species. So this is one of the reasons probably where we find so much therapeutic benefit from them, because they inhibit certain species around them. And that's the premise also of antibiotics. We're using one organism's defense compounds against another organism. So of course, when we're using antibiotics, we're using a very high dose of such a compound, and that can have a major effect on the microbiome in general. And that's not just the microbiome where it's directly exposed, but also all over the entire body. And this is one of the reasons why people, as an example, can get yeast infections from oral antibiotic use. So I do want to make that important distinction that just taking probiotics is not the equivalent to solving the microbiome issues. So the gut flora are definitely temporarily influenced by probiotics, and so is the gut wall, but they're not. The flora isn't typically permanently changed by probiotics. So you might remember that the gut flora are found in a pretty complex biofilm, and it's pretty resistant to sudden changes in flora. Like I said, unless you're taking the drug kind of antibiotic or antifungal or antiviral. So oral probiotics will stabilize and initiate a change, but they don't create it quickly, and they're not the basis of an entire new microbiome. So in fact, the only thing capable of quickly changing a microbiome to a more normal state is a fecal sample from another healthy human. So you may have heard about that. Sometimes if we have people who have to do long-term antibiotics, we have them take fecal samples of their own or of healthy relatives, first-degree relatives, household relatives, and freeze it to use for reinoculation after the antibiotics are done. That will actually turn around the microflora in about a day. Whereas if you just go on antibiotics, it can take up to a year for your antibiotics to complete, or for your microbiome to completely heal. It's one of the problems with having to take antibiotics. So what I'm hoping you're kind of beginning to see is that there's lots of assumptions about the use of probiotics and ferments, as well as their influence on the gut microbiome, but really they're not exactly the same thing. And the effect of both is very related to diet. And so once again, we're going to come back to our start here, start now diagram about what the optimal diet likely is on average for humans. And I'm just going to show you that diagram one more time. And if you haven't, if this isn't familiar to you, or you haven't seen this on a webinar, if you haven't joined us for webinars before, this is part of the Start Here, Start Now course that you can find on the learning tabs of whole life medicine. And so this epidemiologically is quite likely the most healthy diet for people in general. Now, depending on who you are, you're going to put different things into these sections of the plate. So, but 50% of your plate should really be non-starchy vegetables, 25% high quality protein and fat, 12% maximum fruit, 12% starchy vegetables and whole grains, 1% ferments, like we are talking about, and 1% salts and seaweeds. Oh, pardon me. So variety is super key in these. Like you don't want to just choose one non-starchy vegetable for your non-starchy veggies. But often when we do metabolic typing, we might play with the proportions a little tiny bit depending on what's going on with you. But from a worldwide standpoint of study, you can see that people who have this kind of diet are the healthiest people on the planet. And so this is actually not too difficult to reproduce. So even if you don't know what your metabolic type is, you could easily follow this and really do a great job of feeding your flora and feeding yourself. So there actually isn't a lot known about the specifics of how fermented products affect the gastrointestinal system, but there are studies that have observed benefits under different conditions. So fermented foods have been correlated with improvements in cholesterol, in blood pressure levels, a reduced risk of type 2 diabetes, a reduction in gut irregularities, and like we talked about before, live microorganisms' metabolic activity modifies that physical and nutritional characteristics of food by breaking down complex components and forming byproducts that you might not otherwise get out of foods. And those sometimes can have a really big impact. So in fact, fermented foods that are containing fermented products but no living viable microorganisms also seem to have some health benefits because of this. So some of the byproducts of fermentation seem to have an effect on bacterial growth. They could affect the microbiome as well as a result. So it's not useless to eat ferments with no live bacteria in them. They do make things more digestible. They're obviously just not as complex of a product. Obviously, if you have an imbalanced microflora, you can also aggravate the living daylights out of it by consuming both live and non-live ferments. So it can be difficult to figure out in advance how taking in any ferment is going to interact with your guts. And it's important that when you introduce a new ferment that you're kind of really observing what's happening. I certainly have witnessed a fermentation newbie getting so excited about the health promoting benefits of a ferment that they just go totally overboard and end up bloated like a balloon. So I think it's really important to observe what works and what doesn't work and slowly make changes to help your guts. It is possible to test to see what your overall microorganisms counts are. It's also possible to do an analysis of your microbiome RNA or genetics, which does give you a sense of the overall ecology of your gut. And if you have some really significant problems, it could be worth investing in these types of analysis to make more specific changes, especially if you notice ferments bothering you. However, if you're not eating the suggested dinner plate, it might just be worth starting there to change your diet to one that supports a more normal microbiota. So just like for your own health directly, the health of your microbiome is really related to how well you feed it. So over-fermentation in your guts causes problems. And this is the basis of doing the FODMAP diet, which is removing fermentable oligosaccharides. So those are different kinds of carbohydrates. And it basically refers to limiting foods that contain carbohydrates that ferment pretty rapidly in the gut and can cause more rapid gas production. And if you suffer from issues like bloating or gas, eating ferments can obviously make that worse. So it's beyond the scope of this webinar, but if you have this issue, you need to consult with your trusted health provider and see if we can just suss that out for you. Of course, we can do that in office for you as well. Now, one thing I wanted to mention is that there's definitely evidence that shows that changes in gut microbiota have an impact on mood. So I've definitely seen this in my practice, sometimes occurring as a completely unintentional side effect of gut healing, where the mood change clearly was a surprise to the patient and sometimes to me. And as you may remember from previous webinars, the gut is absolutely the most neurotransmitter and hormone-rich location in your body. So changes here have an impact on how you feel in every way. Your gut and brain have a really close relationship. It's known as the gut-brain axis. We've talked about this in previous webinars. And 90% of our serotonin, which is often known as like the happiness neurotransmitter, or at least one of them, is produced in the gut. So there's a widely studied connection, and there's always research coming out about how the foods we eat can affect our mental health. And I actually was going to quote here a study that I found, and here's what that quote said: that depression and other mental health disorders are characterized by chronic low-grade inflammation and oxidative stress. So a traditional diet rich in antioxidant, anti-inflammatory foods may confer some level of protection against depression. We've also noted that intestinal inflammatory biome appears to exist, one that can contribute to altered mood via intestinal permeability, systemic LPS burden. So that's actually, to interject, molecules that are being produced by abnormal bacteria, and even direct to brain microbe communication. So such an inflammatory microbiome may be facilitated at least in part by Western dietary habits. Research shows that high fat or high sugar and low nutrient value foods are commonly consumed by those with depression, anxiety, and high levels of chronic distress, thus contributing to the likelihood of an inflammatory microbiome. Preliminary research in rodents and humans suggests that the behavioral consequences of an inflammatory microbiome can be offset by the administration of beneficial microbes. And all of this leads us full circle to the ancient Neolithic vessels and asking to what extent fermented foods or beverages might contribute to mental health. So that just kind of gives you a sense of the research. This has really been a more recent research area. You certainly didn't see a lot of research about fermentation before it became so popular. So you might be thinking, okay, let's go buy some stuff. And that would be quite fun. So I have to tell you that you might have to scrounge around a little to find fermented items that you can buy with live culture. So many of the products that traditionally would have contained microorganisms are now pasteurized. So even dairy products are first pasteurized and then they're re-inoculated. It's just mostly because of fear, honestly. So many people still remember having foods that have gone bad, prior to having reliable refrigeration. Certainly, I remember my grandparents talking about that. So there are things that are naturally fermented and then pasteurized, like sauerkraut. So you're still getting the fermented byproducts in there, but not the live bacteria. So fermentation is really best as a small batch process, and no two batches really typically taste the same. So in our modern food culture, people really like consistency, and industrial food production is usually oriented towards that. So that whole canning and pasteurization really became the new food science, and hygiene became this like massive Western cultural obsession. So I chalk it up to the human tendency to sneer at anything kind of mildly different. I'm thinking it's some sort of like biological protection behavior that we like everything to be so consistent. But of course, it's not nearly as fun or as experimental. And there are some brands here that you can buy that are unpasteurized. So like Bubby's Pickles and Sauerkraut is one. Holy Kraut, the Wild brand of ferments that have kind of a whole bunch of different flavors of sauerkrauts, or also the red cabbage sauerkraut. And of course, yogurt and kefir is pretty common. I do recommend, though, that you buy organic, once a one without a stabilizer or a gum, and unsweetened varieties. It just cuts down on sugar intake. It's amazing to me how much sugar they put in yogurt. Sometimes even the organic ones that are just vanilla seem to have so much sugar in them. Kombucha is typically not pasteurized. We have a couple of really great kombucha makers in Calgary. True Booch comes from Calgary, so that's a bottled version that you can buy. There's even a couple of places that, like, literally that's their business, is you go in and get kombucha. So you're going to look for the label raw or unpasteurized for fish sauce, for kimchi, for miso. For a naturally fermented soy sauce, you're going to look for the label tamari, traditionally made. So they exist. You just have to look. Tempeh is cooked, so it's not going to have a live culture. So you're going to look for organic, just to avoid GMO soy. You do have to, like I said, read the label to really determine whether a live culture is present. And it actually may say cultured to indicate a fermentated process. But I grew up eating cultured butter only. That's kind of like a European style. It has that kind of slightly sour twang to it. It actually puts more taste in the butter, honestly. And you easily can get that at grocery stores. Most people just avoid that one, or they don't know what the difference is. But that's the difference. It's actually a slightly fermented butter. So it's illegal in Canada to sell raw milk. But if you know a farmer and you can get even a little sample, that can really help you make a starter, like a natural starter, if you're thinking about making your own dairy ferments. So why don't we look at how to make some of your own? So let's start with fermented veggies. So pickling and fermenting are sometimes confused with each other, but they actually are distinctly different. So the pickling process preserves food in a brine. So salt, or basically salty water, or an acid like vinegar with a starter culture if you need it. So some veggies don't even require a starter culture. So cabbage doesn't require that. Cucumbers don't require it. Carrot and other root vegetables actually don't even need a starter culture. Others require a starter culture. The most basic starter culture is whey. So that's the liquid from yogurt. So basically all you need to do is get a liter of organic yogurt, tie it up in a cheesecloth, or like a couple layers cheesecloth, put it in a glass dish and just let the whey drip out for 4 hours in the fridge. So, and that whey will keep in the fridge for about 6 months, but it's basically a lactobacillus liquid is what you're getting out of that. And so you can accelerate the fermentation of pickles with that. So if you're concerned about using whey, you can make a non-dairy starter culture from an already made product like beet kvass or coconut water or a water kefir. You can get those grains. We're going to talk about that more in a sec. Kimchi juice, kombucha juice, pickle juice, raw apple cider vinegar. So as long as it's live, you can steal the organisms from it. The only thing is that you're going to have to pay attention to what it tastes like. So you might not want to make, like a certain kind of pickle that you want it to be sweet with something that is sour. So you have to use your judgment a little bit on what to steal. Now, the easiest thing to do is to start with sauerkraut. So sauerkraut is actually the first ferment I ever made, and I don't think that's an uncommon experience. Interestingly, I did not learn this from either my German nor my Ukrainian grandmother. Even though they served it up, they actually never made it from scratch. So instead of that, I learned in microbiology lab when I was in my undergrad degree. And so I was a bit suspicious of the whole thing because I was like 18. And firstly, I couldn't believe that just brine and cabbage were going to produce anything edible. Plus, we kept the sauerkraut in the lab fridges, which I have to tell you, that seems a little questionable. Nothing like putting the sauerkraut near the E. coli cultures. But it actually worked out better than I thought. And it is one of the most simple ferments to make because basically you just grate cabbage into a glass bowl. So when you make a ferment, a lot of the time you should not use metal. It puts kind of an acidic twang in it. So you use like metal or a pottery bowl to mix things. And so you put the cabbage in, you put in 4% salt by weight of the cabbage. So if you have 100 grams of cabbage, you're putting in 4 grams of salt. And you want to use salt that's not table salt. So table salt in this country contains aluminum as an anti-caking agent. And like most anti-caking agents, it interferes with fermentation. So you could use like a good quality sea salt. Technically, you could use Himalayan salt if you wanted to, whatever. But ideally, what you want to do is massage the salt into the cabbage. And what will start to happen is the cabbage will start to leak fluid. It'll start to leak its cellular fluid when you use the salt like this. And so you don't even need to put water in this usually. So especially if you have a kind of a fat, juicy cabbage, you massage all of the salt into the cabbage. And then you pour all of that into a nice jar. You can use a mason jar, like in this example. And then you push it all down, you pack it all down. And usually, if you've done the salt cabbage ratio correctly, you're going to see that there's enough brine that's produced by that to come up to the, good over the cabbage. And then you're going to reserve usually a leaf of the cabbage and cut it to kind of fit so that you can use that to push down all of the shredded, grated cabbage. Usually works really well too if you can really shred it well. I will usually use a mandolin for that, or I have an attachment on my food processor that will grate it all pretty small. Of course, you got to remember that you want it to look nice also when you get it out at the end, so it can't just be little shards either. But you want to slice it super thin, or like I said, use a mandolin. And so then you put the reserved leaf or two on the top. You have to put something like a weight on it to keep it down. I usually just put a big clean rock on it and then you just wait. So you don't even need a fancy crock. You do have to check it every day to make sure there's enough brine, keeping the cabbage submerged. And you can, like I said, you can get a fancy one with a cover. Or like I said, you could just do a mason jar that, in our climate where it tends to be drier, things can evaporate more quickly. My mom used to have that really fancy crock from Medalta. I don't know if you guys remember Medalta potteries. Basically, we ended up using the big sauerkraut crock for magazines in our family room at some point. So, but as an aside, if you have a chance, you should go take a look at the Medalta Pottery Museum in Medicine Hat. They have like all the pottery and all the crocks. You might even recognize crocks that you remember your moms or grandmas having if they grew up in this province. So you can, of course, do more exciting things to sauerkraut. You can learn how to put flavoring in it. The classic flavoring is caraway. That's what's shown in this picture here. But you can start to play with that. You can make it dill, or you could make it curry. You could make it whatever floats your boat, really. And you just are going to add that in or massage that into the cabbage as well. And you have to experiment a little bit with how much you would need to make it taste good. That's part of fermentation, experimentation. So like I was saying before, kombucha is made from using a SCOBY mixed with sweetened tea. So the sugar is necessary for the fermentation. And basically you're making hot tea, you're pouring in sugar to dissolve. You add extra water to reduce the temperature and to make some volume. And then you add this SCOBY, which is usually kind of a jar-sized disc, and then a cover that breathes, just like it shows here. And then you just basically leave it to percolate in there for about 7 days at room temperature. So mid to high 70s. I mean, now that it's like 110 here this week, maybe it would go faster than that. So you might have to start tasting more quickly. But usually at the 7th day mark, you just get a nice mix between sweet and sour in the kombucha. And then you usually make a second fermentation to bottle. So you drain that off. And because it's bubbly, you need bottles that have seals to kind of keep kombucha. And you can make ginger kombucha, like I've listed here, by just adding fresh ginger in each of the bottles. Once you're kind of satisfied with how the kombucha tastes, you could just put a teaspoon or so in a 2-cup bottle, so 16 ounces or so. And you can just leave the ginger in there, or you could actually take it out if you wanted to after a couple days at room temp. And so you just let that carbonation and the flavors build up. And then you could also add juice to that. So some people add about a 1/4 cup or so of juice per 2 cups of kombucha. And then once you've kind of got a product that you kind of like the taste of, then you just refrigerate it and keep it at that carbonation, because when you put it in the fridge, the fermentation stops. So, I mean, historically, when you look at products, a lot of the time they're made at certain times of the year to take advantage of either speeding up the fermentation or slowing it down. And I'm going to talk to you in a second about another example of that. So a SCOBY will replicate itself. So you can buy a SCOBY really easily. There's a place called Karma Cultures in Calgary. You can just Google them. And they can set you up with your own SCOBY and a kombucha brewing kit too, if you want to be fancy about it. They basically give you all the ingredients or all the items that you would need to do this, including the jar. They pack it all in the jar and they send you with a SCOBY, and then you could just do it yourself. Or you could borrow one from a friend, because they self-replicate. And is all the sugar used up? Not 100%, because if you let all the sugar be used up, it will taste really sour, Holly. So you're basically waiting to get that perfect mix of it's slightly sweet and bubbly and a little bit twangy. So it's a kind of a line. And some people like their kombuchas kind of like that drier. It's kind of like the difference between the sweet white wine lover and the dry white wine lover. Some people don't like that sweetness in it. Honey is usable, but you will still end up having to put some sugar in there usually. So you could use it to kind of flavor it a little bit, but you can't use 100% honey, no. So a SCOBY lives probably about 6 to 12 months, as long as you don't have to have an active culture going. You can just keep it in a jar with a little bit of extra kombucha to keep it covered. And they'll last like almost a year, depending on the temperature, of course. And they usually can be reused for about 10 brews, like of one of those big 4-liter jars. And then you can just throw them away, because remember, you're making a new one pretty much every time. So You can throw away the old one if you want, but most of the time they'll last a while. And it doesn't matter if it turns a tiny bit brown. Actually, if you have a small brown covering on your SCOBY, that's actually some of the yeast that makes the process work. It doesn't matter if the SCOBY tears. It doesn't have to be a beautiful disc. So it's pretty easy. Now, the next thing I thought you might be interested in seeing is that you can actually make your own miso if you want. So miso is made from fermented soybeans, and it has just a great like umami flavor. So that is the flavor that has been most recently characterized as being very typical of some of those fermented products that are more grain-based or soy-based. So miso is actually made from just 4 ingredients. It's soybeans, obviously, salt, rice, koji starter, which is actually aspergillus. That's a kind of, it's kind of like mold, and filtered water. So the magical ingredient in miso is thyme, because basically you can assemble like pre-soaked, pressure-cooked soybean mash with the rice starter, and after about like a day, you'll be done most of the process. It's like, because it's just the pre-soaking and the cooking time that takes so long. So white miso is the least fermented. So you may have seen like different kinds of miso, and they listed as different colors. So white miso is the least fermented. That takes usually about 4 to 6 months, depending on the temperature of your house. But to get red miso, like is pictured here, that could take up to 1.5 years. So it's still pretty cool to give it a whirl. So I love using miso in things like soup, but also like sauces. I put it in lots of different things. Gravies, if you're making gravy for whatever, doesn't matter what you're making it for. It just has that really amazing complex flavor to it. So maybe you give it a whirl. Now, one last thing I just wanted to mention as a possibility is you can make what's called beet kvass. So that's a fermented beverage made out of beets, obviously. And it has a lot of uses. Certainly in the former USSR, it was used for a lot of things, cocktails, vinaigrettes. It can be used on its own. It's considered a health product. I've definitely been in European clinics that use this as part of their dietary protocols. It's got a pretty earthy flavor and a bit of fizziness. Super easy ferment to make from beets on a little starter, like whey starter, and salt and water. So it's kind of like the pickle of beets, but you're just using the juice. You can still use the beets if you want, of course, but you're kind of aiming at that. It's slightly fizzy. It's not full on carbonated though, but it tastes pretty interesting. And if you like beets, might be your way of doing things. So I think there's some great books out about fermentation nowadays. There's a man named Sandor Katz, Katz. He wrote Wild Fermentation. You can even get America's Test Kitchen's Foolproof Preserving. So those have some great basic recipes in them. You can also get the NOMA Guide to Fermentation. So NOMA is N-O-M-A. This is actually a cookbook from a well-known Copenhagen-based restaurant. It's basically ranked as one of the top restaurants in the world, and they use basically a ton of ferments. They actually ferment almost everything on their menu. So they have like paint your corn on the cob with a paste of fermented blueberries. It just sounds super cool. So sometimes for inspiration, you can even look at something a little bit more complex like that too. So if you've already tried certain kinds of ferments and you want to kind of think outside the box, that would be a great resource to find. So I am hoping that has given you a pretty good sense of what is going on in fermentation and how you might start this yourself. Again, not going super crazy, but just starting to incorporate a little bit of ferments in your diet, or at least finding some locally that you can add in. So here's what I planned for us for the next several months for the free Alleviates webinars. And I'm hoping you enjoy this as much as I do. I just actually love that so many of you show up to learn every month. So don't forget to go to whole-life-medicine.com to sign up. And next, in July, we're going to talk about bones. Everybody asks me about bones. So thank you so much.
Thanks for watching. I love to connect to my patient community to inform and inspire, and I hope you'll join us again in the near future. Don't forget to check out whole-life-medicine.com for more webinars and events.